subject which is close to my heart because it's philosophical. It's very important Jewishly, and it's pretty deep philosophically and scientifically. I think I can explain it. I think I can explain it reasonably clearly. I'll start it today, and if you find it to be simply too far out or uninteresting, then I'll pick something else for tomorrow. But this, I think, is really crucial. We talk about the soul. There are people who will tell you, soul? Are you joking? Listen, under your cranium, there's mush, meat. And meat is a purely mechanical stuff. And you are a meat machine. And everything you do is just determined by how the meat under your cranium, how the electrical impulses are carried through, and how the transfer of ions across the synapses and all the rest. That's all it is. Talking about something spiritual, something in addition that isn't physical, has anything to do with the way you behave or what happens to you. This is just without any reason, rationale whatsoever. They will tell you we are materialists. We know the world is made out of material substances, molecules, atoms, particles, and they operate according to the laws of science, and that's all there is to it. Now, people say lots of things. Question is, what reason do they have to say them? What reasons do they have? So I want to put this question to the believers in that materialist model. What reason do you have backing up your statement that the brain is everything? The brain, and just the brain, and only the brain, does everything. What reason do you have? I'll just tell you, by way of laying some groundwork, materialism, the idea that the world is all physical, is not, in the philosophical world, agreed upon. A book came out from Oxford University Press a year and a half ago called The Waning of Materialism. 27 papers by 27 leading philosophers, all of whom were writing against materialism. And the two leaders of the anti-materialist movement weren't represented there, David Chalmers and Thomas Nagel. So there are some very eminent contemporary philosophers who are against materialism. Anybody who thinks it's open and shut and everybody knows just isn't familiar with that literature. Well, let's start going down the garden path now. So you tell me the brain is everything. Nothing more than the brain. Now I have a toothache. What is that toothache? What is it? And they'll tell you the toothache is something going on in the brain. Certain neurons are firing in certain patterns at certain speeds. And that is the toothache. There's nothing but the brain. The toothache is an event in the brain. Okay, now I ask, what reason do you have for thinking that? What reason do you have for thinking that the toothache and your worry over next week's paycheck and your hopes about summer vacation and your thrill over listening to Rene Capusot play the Beethoven violin sonatas, all the aspects of your experience are just things going on in the brain? What reason do you have for thinking that? The answer you get is, well, we have a correlation. We've done many, many studies. That's an exaggeration, but all right. We've done many, many studies where whenever you have a toothache, this part of the brain is active. And whenever you worry, that part of the brain is active. And whenever you're thrilled, that part of the brain is active. And whenever you're hopeful, that part of the brain is active. We have many, many studies. And we've isolated the parts of the brain that are active when you are having these experiences. Now, just as a footnote, I'll tell you that's greatly exaggerated. But let's leave that aside. Let's assume that they're right. They've done these studies and they found these correlations. Correlations. When you have these and these experiences, those and those aspects of the brain are active, and vice versa. Does that mean that the experiences are what's going on in the brain? Not obviously. The fact that A and B accompany one another, they're found together, they go hand in hand, doesn't mean they're identical. Human beings, at least until recently, all had mothers. Every live human being had a mother. That doesn't mean he was his mother. It meant that human being and mother go together. Whenever you have a human being, you're going to find a mother. That doesn't mean they're identical. Whenever you find a mother, you'll find another human being. Otherwise, you wouldn't be a mother. Doesn't mean they're identical. Or, as one contemporary philosopher put it, John Searle, lightning and thunder go together. But lightning isn't thunder, and thunder isn't lightning.
Is it Berkeley, right?
Yeah.
I was there.
Oh, you were there? He just put out a new book. He's finished over 50 years of teaching at Berkeley, and he just put out a new book, which I have on order from Amazon. I get to the States next week, I'll pick it up in a session. He's unbelievable. John Searle's unbelievable. Huh?
Are you going to Berkeley?
No. But he's a very, very good philosopher. Certain things I don't agree with, but he's a very, very good philosopher. And he's also not a materialist. Well, he's sort of a materialist. Anyway, so the fact that you have a correlation doesn't mean the two things are identical. In order to show the two things are identical, you've got to go further than just correlation. Now the question becomes, well, what further thing must you do? What must you add to finding them always together to take the further step and conclude it's not A and B that are correlated together, but they're the same thing? Now, in science, there's an answer to that question, or indeed, for two different kinds of cases, there are two answers. So the name of the project now is this. Let's try to understand how science does it when science is successful in showing that A and B are identical. And then let's see whether we could transfer that method to experience and the brain. If we could transfer it, then a person could have good reason to say, yes. And we think that experience is just what's going on in the brain. If you can't transfer it, then there's a gap. You have a correlation, and you're claiming identity. There's a gap there. That gap has to be fulfilled. If the way it's done in good science, in acceptable science, isn't going to work, then tell me something else. But you can't just wave your hands and say there's a correlation and jump to the conclusion that there's an identity. So what we want to do is take a look at how science discovers identities. Sometimes science does that. How does science do that? What's behind it? What are the guts of the process of discovering that? And then see whether it can be transferred to experience and the brain. Is it clear what we're up to? Okay. There are two different types of cases where science does this. One sort of includes the other, but they're important to distinguish, and then important along the way to ask what kind of case experience in the brain is. One is sound. What is sound? You all know the answer to that question. Sound is patterns of airwaves, patterns of motions of air molecules. How did science establish that? How did they establish that? Sound has been a matter of discussion for thousands of years. We've known for thousands of years lots of things that sound does. We know how sound behaves. We know what causes sound. We know what effect sound has. That we've known for thousands of years. We just didn't know what sound is. Let's give some illustrations of this material. Sound is made by banging on drums and crackling fires and people talking or singing, or thunder, or these are cases of sound. We know more or less what makes the sound. We know that sound travels through the air. We know the farther away you are from the thing that makes the sound, the weaker the sound is. We know that if you can construct a room which is so tightly sealed that a person who stands in the middle of the room and has a bass drum and bangs the drum, outside nobody hears anything. Obviously, the walls of the room are containing the sound. You have echoes that means the sound bounces. The sound is made here, it's a wall over there, and somebody else hears it as if it's coming from over there, because the sound bounces off the wall and reaches him. So sounds really behave like physical things. Okay, that's nice. But what is the sound? He's banging on a drum over there. George is over there. George hears him banging on the drum. He hears the drum sounds. Something's getting from the drum to George, but I'm standing in the middle. Nothing goes through me. I don't feel anything, you know. So where is it? What is it? It's very peculiar. The way it behaves like a physical thing. But if I ask, well, so what physical thing is it? That's where science was, the whole human race was, until, I don't know, 150 years ago, whenever they came up with the idea.
The same with light.
Yeah, but light's a problem even to today.
Yeah.
But let's just take sound. I'm talking about this where it's successful. Now, somebody said, well, the air is in between. And true, if the drum is over there and George is over there, they bang on the drum and he hears it. You don't feel anything in between. But that's because there are very subtle, very light motions of the air, which your skin is not sensitive to. And it's the motion of the air that carries the sound from the drum to the person, or wherever the sound goes.
Beethoven would hear his notes by putting his ear on the piano.
When he became deaf.
On the floor, yeah.
Yeah, okay, so that means sound is carried through solids as well, and it is, of course.
Almost like
You're right. That's an interesting point. I shouldn't say only that it's sound waves. It's a certain pattern of molecular motion. Sound can be carried through water. Sound can be carried through solids. It doesn't have to be airwaves. Well, we typically deal with our sounds that carry through airwaves, but that's quite true. So now, and this, by the way, makes predictions. If you're in a vacuum, there won't be any sound. That wasn't something we could be confident about before someone said that there are sound airwaves or waves through material. Okay, now, we say science has discovered that sound is airwaves or material waves. How did they discover that? What kind of reasoning led to the conclusion that that's what they are? Not correlated, but that's what they really are. Well, here's the way the reasoning goes. I know lots of things that sound does, and that's all I know. The only thing I know about sound is what it does, how it behaves. Now I ask myself, do material waves of motion do those things? Are they there? When he bangs the drum and he hears it, are there material waves, in this case air waves, between here and there? Yes, there are. Does the solidly packed room stop airwaves from getting out? Yes, it does. And then we can explain why you don't hear the sound outside. When you bang something and make airwaves, do they get weaker as they move further and further away? Yes, they get weaker. Can airwaves bounce off walls? Yes, they can. They can bounce off walls. What you do is this. You start with a concept that's defined what's called functionally. It's defined by how it functions. All you know about it is how it functions. Then you search, deep sea level in the least populated town in Nebraska. You search and you find Q, and you ask yourself, would Q do all those things? All those things that sound does. Would Q do all those things? If Q will do all those things, Q will therefore explain all the things that sound does. Then we conclude that Q is sound. That's how it's done. That's how it's done. Again, you're starting with a concept that has only a functional definition. All I know about sound is what it does. I haven't got a clue what sound is. I find something that does all those functions, that I'm allowed to conclude that that something is what sound is. Okay, are we clear so far? That's one type of identity that science discovers. Then there's another type which is a little more complex. It includes this, but it includes something else as well. We say that science has discovered that water is H2O. Water is H2O. Not correlated with H2O. Water, in fact, is H2O. Here, you have a double job. Not a single job, but a double job. On the one hand, like sound, We know lots of things that water does. Water dissolves various substances. Water freezes at a certain temperature. Water evaporates, boils at a certain temperature. And it nourishes plants and nourishes people, unless it's taken in certain ways, in which case it can kill people. We have lots of information about what water does. But in addition to that, we have samples of water. The stuff that comes out of the tap, what's lying in the pool, what you get off the Tel Aviv coast. We have samples of water. So now, if somebody wants to convince me that water is H2O, he has to do a double job. Number one, like in the case of sound, he'll have to show me that H2O will do what water does. If I have a conglomeration of H2O and I lower its temperature below 0 degrees centigrade, will it become a solid? If I raise its temperature to 100 degrees centigrade, will it boil and not get any hotter? Will a conglomeration of H2O nourish plants? Will it nourish people? Will it drown people if there's too much of it? First thing you want to know is, does H2O do the things that water does? But that's not enough. I have to also have reason to think that what's in my glass is H2O. That's an independent consideration. And we do that because, for example, if you put an electric current through H2O, then it disassociates into hydrogen and oxygen. You say, well, look, what seems to be going on is the electrical current is breaking up the molecules, and you end up with the two elements, the two elementary elements of hydrogen and oxygen. Also conditions under which you can take hydrogen and oxygen and fuse them into water. So that's not functional. That's looking in the glass and saying, I have reason to think that the stuff in this glass is made out of H2O. Now, I want to illustrate to you why both of these are important. Because if you had only one and not the other, you would not be forced to say that water is H2O. Suppose H2O does all of the stuff that water does, but when you attack the stuff in the glass, hydrogen and oxygen just don't come out. They just don't come out. Electricity or radiation, or you just don't find any hydrogen and oxygen in there. Then I think people might say, okay, H2O does all the stuff that water does, but maybe there's another chemical compound that also does all the stuff that water does. And maybe water is that other chemical compound. Since I can't show that the stuff in the glass is H2O, jumping to the conclusion that water is H2O is without foundation. Maybe the stuff in the glass has a different chemical composition that we haven't been able to discover. And maybe that also does the things that H2O does. So I wouldn't be able to conclude it if I couldn't work on the stuff in the glass. If, on the other hand, I attack the stuff in the glass, let's say with electricity, and out comes hydrogen and oxygen, but when I take the formula H2O and ask when will it freeze and when will it boil and will it nourish plants and so on and so on, I get negative answers. No, it freezes at minus 20 degrees centigrade and it boils at 130 degrees centigrade and three drops of it will kill grass and so on and so on. Then what I say? I would say, well, then water can't be H2O. When you pass the electricity through the glass of stuff and you get hydrogen, oxygen, maybe electricity is changing it. Maybe electricity is not just separating it out into its elements, but it's changing it. It's mangling it. And that's why you get hydrogen and oxygen. In order to be convinced that water is H2O, since my concept of water has two parts, two dimensions. One part is functional. I know a lot of things that water does. And number two, I have samples of water. To be convinced that water is H2O, I got to handle both of them, the functional and the samples. I handle a function by saying, you think that water is H2O? Show me that H2O will do what water does. And I handle the samples by saying, show me reason to think that the sample's made of hydrogen and oxygen. Indeed, H2O, not H3O or H2O2, that's heavy water, and so on. So that's how it works with water. With water, you have H2O, the formula that does all the things that water does, and you have a way of getting reason to think that what's in the glass is made of hydrogen and oxygen. And then you can conclude that water is H2O. Have we got it so far? Those are the two known ways that science discovers identities. So now the question will be, well, does either of these patterns fit experience and the brain? Can we use either of these patterns to show that experience just is what goes on in the brain? The first question we have to face, this is the first, I would say, subtle point, is what kind of comparison shall we make? Shall we compare experience and brain to sound and airwaves? Or shall we compare experience and brain to water and H2O? Is experience something about which we have only functional information? We know lots of things that experiences do. We know how they behave. We know under what conditions they are caused and what effects they have. Or is experience something that, in addition, we also have samples of? Now, I'm trying to be careful not to let my prejudices show here.
Does samples have to be a physical thing?
No, they just have to be samples of experience. We are now questioning whether experience should be understood as physical or not. Question is whether experience...
Memory. Is that
Okay,
what you mean?
okay.
Samples of experience?
Well, how about some of the examples I gave you already today? How about,
Like with water.
how about a toothache?
You have a sample of sound. You can recreate it over and over, and you can measure what happens, but you can't like have a sample of sound.
Okay, that's an interesting... Yeah, but I'm starting from the other end. I'm starting from the before I know what it is. You say you can't have a sample because it's a process. It's motion, right? But that's after you've already discovered what it is. I'm talking now about before you discover what it is. Before we discovered that sound is a certain process, all we had was functions. That's all we knew about it. With water, we have functions and samples before we understand what it is. The samples of water set the bar higher. They make the challenge harder. In order to convince me that water is H2O, you got to do a double job.
So no, you can't have samples of experience then.
Well, what about a toothache?
Is it a sample? So you can have, if you're having the experience, like in that, while you're having it, you have a sample.
Yeah, and I think that's all the time, isn't it? When you're awake, aren't you experiencing something all the time when you're awake?
Yeah, it's a weird way of thinking of a sample, but yeah.
Yeah, right. I mean, there are samples of experience you've never had. You know, like standing on top of Mount Everest. You've never had that experience. Okay, but there are lots of samples you have had.
Okay.
I mean, it's hard to escape the idea that this is absolutely crashingly obvious that we have experiences. We know them by having them. I'm just mentioning this partly for the recordings and to give you an insight into how weird contemporary philosophy is. There are contemporary philosophers, minority, thank God, who deny this. They say there are no experiences. Now, how to deal with them other than to say, why don't you drive a cab? I don't know. You know, I mean, the most obvious thing is that there are experiences. There's nothing more obvious than that. I can have experience of a toothache and someone say, it's psychosomatic, there's nothing wrong with your tooth. He might be right.
They say like impressions have no ontology or something. Like,
Not familiar with that phrase, but I'd have to see in context. I don't know what it means. But, you know, someone might say your pain is psychosomatic. There's nothing wrong with your tooth. He might be right, but he can't tell me I'm not having a pain. That would just be, you know, or there are no pains and you've never experienced anything. That's just beyond belief. Okay. So that means that in the case of experience, there's a double job. If you want to convince me that experience is what goes on in the brain, you have a double job to do. Number one, show me that what goes on in the brain has the same functions as experience. And number two, show me that what goes on in the brain is the experience. Take a sample and show me that that's what's going on in the brain. Now, the burden of my argument, it's not mine, it's the argument of many contemporary good philosophers, is that You may be able to do the functional job, but you're not going to be able to do the sample job, not just because science hasn't yet cracked that problem, get some more money from NIH and just hire some more researchers, and we'll get it, next decade, but because it's a problem that in principle is beyond dealing with. That's the direction in which we are going to go. Let's start with the functional stuff first, where it does work. And then, I don't know if I'll get beyond that today. Even tomorrow, by the way, I'll rehearse everything. I'll review everything because this is not exactly simple stuff. And after 23 hours, you might have some responses you want to share. What do we know about the way experience behaves? Well, we know a lot of things that cause experiences. When somebody steps on my foot, I feel a pain. And when somebody bangs on a drum, I have an auditory experience. That's not sound. Sound is the motions of the air. The hearing is an auditory experience. They're not the same at all. Indeed, he can bang on a drum. If I stick my fingers in my ears, I won't have an auditory experience. The sound is there, but I'm not hearing it. Or eat the wrong things, you'll have a stomach ache. Or, for me anyway, listen to Beethoven, I'll have a thrill. So there are a lot of things that cause experiences, and we all know this. And there are effects that experiences have. For example, somebody steps on my foot, and I have the pain, therefore, that probably will issue in some kind of behavior on my part. I might yell, or I might take more drastic action of one kind or another, considering the person who stepped on my foot. Who knows, right? I might go for an aspirin. We know lots of things that cause experience, and we know lots of effects that experience has. Now somebody says, look, I can show you very clearly that what carries those functions is what's in the brain. Okay, let's see. Well, look, when he steps on your foot, there's neural impulses that go all the way up to the brain. We can trace them. We can show them to you. Indeed, if we cut the neural track, you won't feel anything. So obviously, it goes up to the brain, and then various parts of the brain start working. And then when you yell, ouch, go for an aspirin or take action concerning the person who stepped on your foot. Those are all dictated by neural impulses coming from the brain and shooting out to the muscles in various ways. It seems quite reasonable to say that functionally, when you're talking about what causes experience, and we're talking about the effects that experience have, what mediates it is events in the brain. I wouldn't say there are no problems there, but it seems quite reasonable to say it. If somebody said that it's brain events that mediate the things that experience does, or the things that cause experience, I think they could make a reasonably good case for that. That's not where the problem lies. Where the problem lies is in finding the actually felt experience in the brain. That's like finding the H2O in the glass of water. Now, there are two ways to do this in principle. You can go in one of two directions. You can either say, okay, I'm having a toothache. Let's see if I can sort of pull the toothache apart. Separate it out into its elements, into its most elementary pieces, and find that when I pull it away and clear off all the sand and look at it under a microscope, I see neurons. That's what they are. The feeling of pain is neurons. And then I could say, so you see, it's built. That's like passing electric current through the water and getting H2O. You're taking the sample and you're pulling it apart into its elements and finding that indeed it's made up of the stuff you want it to be made up of. When you pass the electric current through the water, you get hydrogen, oxygen. So you say, okay, so you see it's made of hydrogen, oxygen. Here the idea would be to start with the experience and pull it apart and unravel it and look for its simplest parts and find out that they're neurons. That's one way to do it. The other way to do it would be to start on the other end. Go into the brain and study the way the neurons work, study how they come together, study how they interact with one another, study how complexes of neurons work, until you can see a toothache in the brain. That's building it up from the neurons to get the toothache. Now, people have tried this. Both have tried it intuitively in both directions and have come up with nothing. And then in addition to that, they've come up with reasoned arguments why you can't come up with anything. So let me just try to introduce you to the intuitions today. As I said, tomorrow we'll go back over all of this. And then tomorrow I'll introduce you to some of the arguments that show that you're not going to be able to do it. Let's start with what I'm experiencing at this moment. Okay, so I'm seeing things, hearing things. I feel my body against the chair. I feel the gentle breeze of air in the room. I'm not smelling anything. I'm not tasting anything at the moment. But I have those three sensory areas operating my experience. And somebody says, well, okay, let's just boil it down. Boil it down. Okay, subtract what I'm feeling, subtract what I'm hearing. Let's just talk about what I'm seeing. So we've not just eliminated two sensory areas and just talk about vision. Okay, I see this gigantic variety of shapes and sizes and colors, textures. Okay, let's talk about color. Leave aside shape, leave aside size, leave aside perceived texture. There's such a thing as perceived texture. When you see something, you could see what it would feel like. Leave that all aside. Let's talk about color. Okay, but now color is made up of hue and saturation and brightness or something. There's like three elements in color. Let's just talk about hue.
Opacity.
What's this element?
Opacity.
Opacity?
How transparent it is.
Okay. So let's just talk about hue. That's what corresponds in physical terms to the wavelength of the light. Okay, so now look at this brown object. And there's a number of different hues. Okay, take that spot, just that spot, and consider the hue that you are experiencing on that spot. Any neurons in sight? Do you see neurons peeking around the corner? Do you say, listen, when I had tactile sense and auditory and visual, that was very complicated. Lots and lots of things going on at the same time. And when I took the visual, there were all these different shapes and sizes and colors and so forth and so on. It's very, very complicated. But I'm boiling it down. Color. No, but color has three dimensions. Just hue. Are we getting closer and closer to neurons? Can you sort of see in dim outline neurons hiding behind the screen there and say, oh, yeah, that's just a bunch of neurons? I don't think we're getting anywhere. It's all experience. It's all experience. Okay, it's a piece of experience. But it's no less experience, no more transparently physical, no closer to electricity passing from neuron to neuron than we were before. The project of taking the experience apart, pulling it apart, looking at its simplest elements and discovering that its simplest elements are neurons just doesn't seem to be going anywhere. It's not at all like, consider someone's examining the brain before microscopes. And he has magnets and he has, if they knew about electricity at that time, he says, look, this thing has electrical properties. It has magnetic properties. I wonder why it does that. Wonder how it does that. Don't know. Then you get microscopes that are more and more powerful, and finally the neurons come into view. Wow, look at that. About 100 billion of them underneath your skull. Okay, fine. Now, they have synapses. And look at this. Stuff's going back and forth between those synapses. I wonder what that stuff is. It turns out that stuff is electrically charged. You say, wow, look at that. That's where the electricity of the brain is. It's in those things going back and forth between those legs. See, that's how you could do it. You start off with gray matter. Doesn't look like it's got little, long, tiny, thin bags of stuff in it with legs that transmit stuff from place to place. But when you go into it more and more deeply, you finally find those bags with the legs at the end and the stuff going across. And then you can say, yes, now I see that the electricity in the brain is made up of interactions between neurons. Is anything like that happening with the experience? I pull it apart. I eliminate aspects. I slice it.
of.
Huh?
Kind of, maybe in a way, we can change parts of the brain and then find correlative changes in the experience.
Yeah.
So we can say this experience of me being in here is a combination of my experience visually, which we can alter in the brain. It's a combination of my experience in memory. I'm comparing the sound of those birds to the sound I heard yesterday. I can feel all these different things. And when we change a little bit of the brain, we see a corresponding change, like almost like a mirror image
Okay.
reflected in the experience. So it almost seems like you can break down the experience into component experiences, not indefinitely, not like water into H2O,
Yeah.
but the pieces the experience is made up of seem to correlate with even smaller pieces that the brain's made up of.
Okay, good. Now, let's go back to the beginning of this hour. Where did we start at the beginning of this hour? I asked, what evidence can the scientific world present for thinking that experience is what goes on in the brain? And I said, the evidence that they will present is correlations.
Right, yeah.
That's what I said. Now you're repeating that. Okay. But then I said, correlation doesn't prove identity. A can be correlated with B and be different things, like thunder and lightning are correlated, but thunder is not lightning.
With the water and H2O, what do we have beyond correlation? And with sound and vibration, what do we really have beyond correlation?
Okay, so what we have in water and H2O beyond correlation is that the H2O formula explains what the water does. You say, why does water boil at 100 degrees centigrade? Because H2O will function that way, will vibrate that way, because I
Can
can...
say that the brain explains the experience?
I don't think
It's the
so.
story that we tell
I don't
about-
think so. The brain doesn't explain why it feels that way.
Brain just feels.
It only would explain it if you assume that the brain is, in fact,
That's
experience.
That's right.
Right.
But that's
Sound-
exactly
okay,
the
so
assumption.
Sound and vibration, then. What do we have beyond the core? Every time there's a vibration, there's a sound. Because we can poke the brain, and somebody will think they're hearing a sound, but there's no vibration.
Because I can use the definition of sound, which is the material waves or the airwaves, to explain what the sound does. If you ask me why, when I have a very tightly closed room, you bang on the drum, and people outside don't hear it, that's not just correlated. I can explain it. It's airwaves banging against the walls of the room, and outside, nothing bangs because they're too weak to make the walls bang. I can actually explain why it does what it does in straight physical terms. That's what we need. That's exactly what. Now, in the case of the function of experience, I think we could explain it. There we could explain it. How is it that stepping on his toe resulted in punching him in the nose? I'll tell you why. He stepped on the toe, and then the neural impulses went up to the brain, and the brain then sent signals to the muscles, and the muscles led to the punch. That's all physical.
It's reflex.
Stepping on the foot is physical, the punch is physical, and the in-between is also physical. That's a very good explanation.
Explanations can't cross that physical, non-physical.
Well, maybe yes, maybe no. That's what we're experimenting.
Spinoza's-
That's what we're trying. That's what we're trying to assess. Not assuming that. If I assume that, then my discussion would be worthless. I'm trying to see how to cross that barrier, and I'm saying let's use the ways in which science has successfully crossed the barrier and see if they apply here. Crossing the barrier in the case of the sample means not just finding a correlation, but showing that there's reason to think that the sample's actually made up of this stuff.
The explanation is still just like a story.
Sure.
It's metaphysics.
I don't know.
And it works
Metaphysics, when
because the
you...
correlations are so reliable.
I don't say why you call it metaphysics. I drop sugar in tea, and the sugar dissolves in the tea, and I know the sugar is made of certain molecules, and the molecules have certain electrical forces, and the tea...
What you're observing is mechanical, but the explanation is metaphysical.
Why do you call it metaphysical?
Because it's not
Chemical.
It's pure
saying that
chemistry.
this causes, like one thing causes another thing.
That's definition of mechanical physics.
No, it's not.
Chemical.
You can watch something happening and you're seeing a physical process, but explaining which part of the process is causing another part of the process is you're telling a story.
Yeah, but that's true for billiard balls also. And it wasn't my hope that it would go in the pocket. They got it there. It was by pushing it with a cue stick. So I'm telling you which part caused it. But we have good reason to think that, don't we?
I mean, if you ever have good reason to tell something about causation, but like, I don't know, I'm trying to argue that all causal explanations are really like a story that explain correlation. Like you never really have
Look,
anything beyond correlation.
Oh, but now you're talking about a different kind of correlation. You're doing David Hume now, and Hume's critique of causation. I've used it many times, and it's important for us. But it's not the same. It's not the same correlation we're talking about now. We're not talking. It's say not the same correlation. It's a correlation to an entirely different purpose. Here I'm talking about finding two things associated with one another. I'm not talking about one thing causing another at all. I'm
So
talking
you're
about
saying identity. We're talking about identity and not causation. Like the identity of the brain activity.
Right. The person who wants to say that experience is brain events doesn't want to say that experience is caused by brain events. No, because then you have to say they were different. Cause and effect can't be identical. No, he wants to say every time you have a pain, a toothache, you have this brain process, and it's not that the brain process causes the toothache,
Right.
but it is the toothache.
Right. So then, what is so convincing that the sound, the vibration, is the experience of the sound?
What's convincing about it
There's an
is
identity.
what's convincing about it is that I can explain why the sound does what it does. Imagine that every time imagine every time there were a sound, imagine every time there were a sound, the air turned purple.
Yeah.
So would I say, oh, so sound is purple color? I would not say that. That wouldn't be good enough. I would want to know, does the purple explain what the sound does? If it doesn't, then it's just an accompaniment. Why should I say it is the sound? Every time there's a sound, there's purple color. So there's two things now, and I have to explain both of them. I wouldn't say the sound is the purple color just because it's associated.
You didn't explain why the vibrations in some medium cause the sensation that we call sound.
Well,
The best you can do is say, well, it vibrates like the inner eardrum,
That's biology.
which
Right.
then affects the brain.
that's right. That's
then
right.
those are still correlative events.
Good. So let's, if for the person who believes that the sensation is in the brain, he can explain it also, right? It's just things that happen in the brain. If he doesn't, subtract that part. This is an important point. People have raised this point. Subtract that part. But all the other things that sound does, we can explain by saying that it's airwaves. Even that the soprano's voice shatters the glass, right? We can explain that.
But sound is inherently a subjective experience.
No, not sound. Hearing is an experience. Sound is an experience.
But sound doesn't. Nobody ever asked what sound is before they heard something. Like
That's true.
the
That's what.
concept of sound only exists in an experiential.
Yeah, but so
framework.
what?
You can
But-
talk about the vibrations of through
the air.
music. Yeah, but that's not what we're talking
No.
about.
No.
How do you know that sound?
But the fact that hearing caused me to ask the question doesn't mean the question's about the hearing. I can ask lots of
you
questions.
only know that there's a thing called sound because you hear it.
Correct. But that still doesn't help. That's how I know there's something to look for. That's all. I see footprints in the sand.
But you're saying you're comparing vibrations and motion to sound and saying these two are the same thing.
That's right.
Wait, what?
I mean,
But they're not
take this example,
Why
right?
would you think that they were different things to begin with?
You don't think that they're different. You don't know that the sound waves exist. You're faced 300 years ago with all of what you know about what sound does and no candidate for what it is. No candidate.
What sound does.
That's
What does
right.
What does that mean?
That means you know what kinds of events cause sounds, and you know some of the effects that sounds have. You're very well acquainted with those,
Effects that sounds can have.
Yeah, like making things.
like making things vibrate.
Yeah, making glass,
Making glass
break.
break.
But how can a sound make something vibrate? The vibrations make something vibrate.
You don't know that. All you know is she's singing and the glass breaks,
Back then.
Okay.
right? So now you ask, well, so somehow her singing did that. What is the thing that actually did
The
it?
thing where we say she's singing, that is me. That's an experience that I'm having.
Not at all. That's how you know she's singing. Doesn't mean that her singing. Her singing is in your mind. If you go to sleep, she doesn't stop singing.
Right. But the sound, of it, like the notes, you know.
Sound
The,
exists without
I
your
don't know.
ears
No,
making
note is just a way of describing the sound. The sound is something in between her and you. The sound obviously is what you hear. You hear the sound,
okay.
and it's something, and nobody knows what it
That's
is.
the behavior. That's what you mean when you say.
Something like that. That's right. The functional definition is behavioral. What does the thing do? How does it interact with other things? And I can know that without knowing what it is. I'll give you a very brutal example. when computers were invented in the 70s, early 70s, a guy, I think at MIT, created a program which was interactive. You type things in and it answers you back.
Cleverbot.
He called it Eliza,
Oh, okay.
and it was
Got a lot
playing
of them.
Yeah.
and it was playing the role of a psychotherapist. Now the program,
That's a Turing test.
yeah, well, as you see, it's very crude. The program was made on the basis of word association. Hello, how are you? Tell me, how do you feel today? The machine asks, say, oh, I feel rotten. Tell me why you feel rotten. That's all programmed in, right? You know, tell me about your childhood. You know, your father, your mother. Did you have any pets? Right? People swore that they got better psychological service from this than they got from people. But it's just based on word association,
So
right?
it did pass the Turing test.
So now,
Kinda.
no, not
If you
really.
can't tell the difference
No,
between
no,
an AI
no,
and
no.
a person, it is
No,
passed.
No,
it's-
that's not the
no,
Turing
no,
test.
No, no. It just said that no, Rabbi Gottlieb just said that they only got better service from the computer
So even
than they
knowing it's
did
a
from.
No, they didn't know. They didn't know it was a computer.
If they didn't know it's
But
a
they-
computer, that means that's what the test is. the
Yeah,
Turing test.
not exactly. The test is where you have two people inputting to you, and you ask them both questions, and you two inputs,
tell the difference.
and you can't tell that, and you get to ask any question you want.
By making word associations, is that to say that like the computer didn't even know what rotten meant until you explained why you felt rotten?
It never knew what rotten meant.
Exactly.
It's just an ROTTEN. That's all.
Your explanation
Absolutely.
of it enables it to figure out what it possibly
And by the
means.
way, it would be very easy for a sophisticated person to defeat a computer because there are certain ambiguities in language. Noam Chomsky pointed some of them out that are based on human experiences, which unless you program all human experience into the computer.